Welcome. Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to introduce you to our speaker today. My name is Robert Nichols. I'm a professor in the History of Consciousness department. This is part of the History of Consciousness speaker series, but it's also been made possible through collaboration with a lot of other units on campus. So I want to specifically thank Debbie and the Center for Cultural Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Sociology, Critical Race and Ethnic Studies have also been a part of this. So thanks to all these different units, and I'm looking forward to trying to build more collaboration across these different groups as well. I also want to specifically thank Ruby Barnett and Sadie Lynn, who are our kind of crack organizing team in History of Consciousness and whose labor it is that makes these kinds of events possible. It's a great honor to introduce Robin D.G. Kelley, a distinguished professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. Over several decades of radical pedagogy, activism, and scholarship, Professor Kelley has been both a sharp analyst of and a vital contributor to, a participant in the making of contemporary U.S. history. On my count, he has authored 8 books, edited or co-edited 6 more, and published dozens of essays in both leading academic journals in his field and also such public-facing venues as the New York Times and Counterpunch. Across this prolific and diverse array of interventions, one can discern a certain consistency and core set of concerns. On my reading, at least, at the heart of this vast body of work is an enduring concern to grasp African American and African diasporic cultural and social movements as generative of what he calls radical imagination. This work shows us how social movements such as Black Power or the movement for Black Lives are also modes of thinking and theorizing, and how aesthetic and cultural production, such as most notably in his work jazz and surrealism, have enabled the joy, the energy, the drama, the queer experimentalism, and the utopianism that has enabled oppressed communities to think otherwise, puncturing the stultification of the present and the colonization of the imagination. All this can be found in books ranging from the hard labor of organizing in the Alabama Communist Party in the 30s and 40s. I'm still a huge fan of Hammer and Hoe. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. All the way to what is, I think, the first complete biography of the great jazz pianist and composer Thelonious Monk. His work is also noteworthy. I just really want to signal, I say, simply for the quality of the writing itself. Kelley's prose does not, I think, indulge in typical platitudes or indulge in the jargon and obfuscation of academic writing. It's fluid and it's poetic, but it's also driven by great clarity of purpose. His department profile claims that he's currently completing no fewer than 3 book projects, and we're going to hear today from one of these, namely Making a Killing, Capitalism, Cops, and the War on Black Life. Thank you so much and welcome to the
see. Okay, good. So despite what the slide says, Robert was right. It's really capitalism comes first. And I keep going back and forth about this, and my editors always talk about alliteration, and I'm like, I don't really care about that, you know. The other thing is, I should say from the beginning, first of all, I want to thank you, Professor Nichols, for the invitation, for your patience with me as I changed the dates a few times. To Sadie, to everyone else who organized this event, especially given that the speakers in the speaker series, they make me feel stupid because they're like some giant thinkers, and I don't, you know, I'm not, I barely make any sense sometimes. The other thing, very quickly before I begin, is that I love being at Santa Cruz. I just think this is a fantastic. I mean, for all the problematic things about the city, I mean, the fact of the matter is that I have so many friends here who are here. I was doing the math, and I calculated if I add all the years of everyone I know who's here and just strung them together, it would go back before 1492. I mean, and so it's like I have a lot of history in the room, so I appreciate that. Because time is short, I just want to say very quickly that I just want to acknowledge the victory on the part of our SJP and FJP at UCLA in beating back an onslaught yesterday. I don't know if you looked at the news, but there was an attempt to destroy that encampment, and the folks de-escalated and protect their space in a way with the kind of solidarity that you hardly ever see at universities. We could talk about that, but that's not the subject of my talk. The other thing is, it's noteworthy to just to mention the fact. Yeah. I mean, I feel guilty because I wasn't here. I was actually here, and I was following everyone on Signal. And Signal, that's another thing that I talk to my therapist about all the time. I don't even understand, like, how could people do that? But the other noteworthy thing is tied to my talk is the fact that this is April 29th, which is, everyone knows, is the anniversary of the LA Rebellion. And so there's going to be some resonance there. So let me just begin. And I talked about this book about a month ago at Berkeley when I gave the Jefferson Memorial Lecture. And I did a kind of overview of the whole thing. And this time I decided to do something a little different. And that is, I'm going to give you a brief summary of the book and then really zero in on specifically on Cincinnati and Timothy Thomas, which is an important chapter in there. The blurb that I sent that is on the flyer actually does a pretty good job of describing what the book's about. So I'm not going to repeat those lines. If you haven't read it, read it. But think of making a killing as a kind of historical autopsy that's meant to determine what forces render working class Black people vulnerable to premature death. And the way the book is structured, each chapter opens up with a single casualty, with the exception of one chapter, which I'll mention, an account of their death, a genealogy of their life, and a history of the world that strangled them and their communities. So before the gunshots, the chokehold, blunt force trauma, the needle, and the like, there was a kind of slow violence. The slow violence of unemployment, suppressed home values, predatory lending, underfunded schools, food deserts, public hospital closures, a shrinking welfare state, an expanding carceral state, and the hazards of living in proximity to toxic waste dumps, freeways, bus barns, oil and gas production facilities, and so on. It also, of course, set the stage for the current abolitionist movement expressed most widely in Black Spring 2020. So here's a very brief summary overview of the whole book. So after, there's a prologue titled Jordan Neely's Last Dance, because his life and death actually embodies all the themes in the book, which you'll see. And then followed by an introduction. And chapter 1 briefly sketches the evolution of police from colonial militias to professional departments. Much of the focus, though, of the book is on policing under neoliberal capitalism. When federal cutbacks in the global slump of the 1970s left many municipalities financially strapped. Urban police departments simultaneously became financial burdens as well as vehicles to generate revenue and manage and manufacture social crises. And this is social crisis created by the erosion of social safety net. So violence work, as Nicole Siegel calls it, increased in this period. In fact, we might call it a speed up. Crime rates did rise, but the cause of this speed up in violence work was the ideological and legislative push to lock up more people. The strike wave of the 1970s, the escalation of protests, a general distrust of cops, urban decline caused by capital flight, white flight, and a growing illicit drug trade, reductions in city services, not to mention municipal budget cuts, which began the process of turning the police into these generators of revenue. All of this combined contributed to a general speed up and growing malaise surrounding police work. Now, cities have also been saddled with skyrocketing costs of settling police misconduct cases. Qualified immunity protects officers from any financial responsibility for these settlements. And because the total cost of settlements and judgments usually exceed city budgets, cities cover the shortfall by doing what? By issuing municipal bonds. The bonds used to cover misconduct settlements and judgments are general obligation bonds, which means the money is earmarked for projects that do not generate revenue, leaving taxpayers responsible for paying the debt whose terms prioritize bondholders over the city's budgetary needs. So here is where Wall Street comes in. Banks underwrite and manage the bonds and deal directly with bondholders. Financial institutions collect fees for their services, which, along with interest, increase the real cost of the settlements. And there's no limit on how much banks and financial institutions can profit from these bonds. So, for example, I just give you one from, you can see all the other examples on the slide. Between 2010 and 2017, Chicago paid out a total of $709.3 million in settlements. But given the interest rate over the life of the loan, the city is estimated to owe about $1 billion to the bondholders, plus another $7.1 million in underwriting fees that go to Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Mesro Financial, and the Bank of Montreal. Now, I look at also at private sources of funding, notably the National Police Foundation, established in 1970 in response to the wave of urban rebellions during the 1960s. Thanks in part to a generous grant from the Ford Foundation and corporate donations, police foundations became the conduits for corporations like Amazon, Bank of America, Starbucks, Google, Microsoft, Target, as we call it, and universities. A lot of universities give money to police foundations, and they finance police. They influence policy. They introduce hardware and technologies in which they may have a vested interest, especially in the areas of surveillance, data mining, and management, and the growing field of predictive policing. So when people talk about police budgets, if you just simply look at the governmental budget, that's not the whole amount of money. You have to look at foundations. Now, chapter 2 offers a different genealogy of the war on drugs through the tragic life of Walter Vandermeer, a Harlem kid who died of a heroin overdose in 1969 at age 12. Now, for my generation, I was living in Harlem at the time, he was our Emmett Till. He became a poster boy for a new war on drugs, prompting a flurry of articles, legislation, drug education programs, and theater pieces that many of us had to go to at the time. Now, Vandermeer was not killed directly by the police, but his death was weaponized to criminalize drug addiction, to attack social welfare, to expand urban policing, prioritize punishment over therapy, and advance Big Pharma's methadone market. Simultaneously, the state waged a covert campaign against radical groups such as the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords, which had begun developing natural, community-centered, and effective ways to resist the drug economy and attack addiction. I mean, these are groups that proclaim dope is death. And by the way, this pamphlet written by Michael Cedarwile Tabor, it actually references Walter Vandermeer. Vandermeer, in fact, was kind of the prompt for it. In any case, they proclaim dope is death, pushers, the enemy of the people, racism, the police, and capitalism are the real killers, and considered heroin a manifestation of U.S. imperial and chemical warfare, which they countered through political education and community detox programs. And I talk about Mutulu Shakur, who passed away recently after so much time in prison. And he was really the person who brought, you probably know this already, acupuncture, acupressure, studied it in order to create a detox program at Lincoln Detox Center. Now for their political work, these groups were subjected to war by the very NYPD, whose narcotics division in 1969 was arguably the largest heroin dealer in the city outside of the Lucchese crime family. And this is documented. Meanwhile, as the state proceeded to crush an abolitionist culture of care. Its social welfare education arm, the administrative bureaucratic arm, soft power, entangled Walter and his whole family in a carceral web well before he took his last shot. And there's a lot to talk about with his story. Chapter 3, I'm not going to mention because I'm going to talk about Timothy Thomas, but chapter 4, well, I forgot to show that picture. This is a press conference with the young lords and folks at the Lincoln Detox. Okay, so chapter 4 focuses on Rukia Boyd. She was fatally shot by an off-duty Chicago police officer just 3 weeks after Trayvon Martin's death, and consequently, her death was overshadowed because of gender and partly because the press treats Black homicides in Chicago as routine. But the Chicago Police Department was arguably the city's biggest armed gang. For over half a century, torture, harassment, even assassination were standard procedures in the Windy City, sanctioned and authorized by all other branches of government. And we know this because of Chicago's history of resistance to police repression. And by the way, that chapter is like 100 pages. I'm just telling you, a warning, because there's a lot going on. Now, although more than 2 years passed before a robust movement emerged demanding justice for Rukia Boyd, but when it did, the forces represented arguably the most radical and broad-based abolitionist movement in the U.S., which is the central focus of that chapter. Chapter 5 examines what is now seems like a well-known, well-worn story of Michael Brown Jr. and Ferguson, St. Louis, in the national uprising in response to his killing. But I frame it as a protracted war, told through his family history and going back to Dred Scott and to East St. Louis, the East St. Louis pogrom, to Black female-led labor and tenant organizing, to the formation of Action, the Black Liberators, Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis, the Hands Up United, Millennial Activists United, and Lost Voices, and so many other movements. The young people who occupied West Florissant Avenue in the wake of the killing and public display of Mike Brown's body did not come out of nowhere, but were part of a longer anti-war movement. They stood up not only for Brown, but against a predatory system of policing that used citations, fees, fines, and arrest warrants to extract millions of dollars from mostly poor Black communities. Ferguson became the nation's epicenter of a modern-day abolitionist movement and a model for how to turn protests into political power. And by the way, some of the story, a brief part of that section, that chapter, I do talk about my own experiences with some of the core organizers when we had these meetings about what's next. Not a lot, because I don't, although a lot of these movement people, folks in Chicago, people I know and work with, I don't really put myself in the story. That's one exception, because there's some things that we learned in that meeting that have never been revealed. Not to say that's like a selling point for the book. I'm just saying that's in there as well. In any case, even as progressive, the so-called progressive Black leadership class in St. Louis, many of whom are veterans of the 2014 uprisings, won seats as aldermen, city councilors, state legislators, city and county prosecutors, even the mayor of St. Louis. It's despite that, casualties of police violence continue to mount, like as we speak. Police budgets swelled, police unions became more strident, and even the much touted reforms proved to be ineffectual. Now, whereas Michael Brown has global name recognition, few outside of Mississippi have heard of Jonathan Sanders, who's the subject of chapter 6. So on the night of July 8th, 2015, a white police officer in Stonewall, Mississippi, dragged 39-year-old Sanders from his horse and cart. He was actually being pulled by a cart, and choked him to death. Despite eyewitnesses, the coroner determined the cause of death to be cocaine toxicity. They have no other evidence for that except what the coroner says. Had it not been for his mother, Frances Sanders, who waged a virtual one-woman protest in front of the Stonewall Police Department, and Jackson-based attorney C.J. Lawrence III and future Mayor Chokwe Antar Lumumba, the killing of Jonathan Sanders may never have seen the light of day. Now, this is a story also of deindustrialization and state plunder by way of the war on drugs. Now, Frances worked for the Burlington Mill and Equipment for her whole adult life, basically, until it closed in 2002. And a lot of people lost jobs. The following year, Jonathan had been convicted on possession and sale of cocaine entirely on hearsay testimony from a dealer as part of his plea deal. Now, Sanders served 3 years in Parchment Penitentiary, paid a $5,000 fine, and after his release, he lived with his mother, trained horses, started harness racing, but was constantly harassed by the police. In 2015, the Clark County Narcotics Task Force seized his truck and about $2,500 in cash after allegedly finding drugs on the ground outside of his vehicle. 4 months later, he was dead. Now, no one so far has been held accountable. We could talk about that as well. And by the way, that's an example of civil asset forfeiture, which is also a really important part of the book. Chapter 7 looks at the surveillance, criminalization, and disposability of Black women. Now, policing has done nothing to really ensure Black women's safety or reduce the alarming incidence of femicide that plague Black communities. Instead, Black women continue to be monitored, harassed, criminalized, subject to reproductive control, and rendered disposable. So the chapter opens up with the murder of a Black trans woman named Dominique Remy Fells in Philadelphia at the height of the Black Spring rebellions. And then it looks back to 4 specific waves of Black femicide: Stamford, Connecticut, and Washington, D.C. in the 70s, Boston in the 80s, and Los Angeles from the early 80s to 2016. Now, deal with state complicity in the disappearance of Black women and the prosecution of women of color who defend themselves, like Desi Woods, for example. In fact, given the militarized landscape of South Los Angeles in the 80s, it's easy to classify these women as casualties of war, casualties of the war on drugs, which heightened police harassment of sex workers, especially as the crack cocaine economy reshaped the sex economy. So the chapter also focuses, on Black feminists who led these movements and whose radical analysis of femicide, economic precarity, and sex work, notably figures like Nkenje Toure, Loretta Ross, Barbara and Beverly Smith, Demeter Frazier, Margaret Okazawa Ray, Wilmette Brown, and Undaye, and Margaret Prescott, who's pictured there. Finally, chapter 8, which is unfinished, and I haven't decided if I'm even gonna finish it and just finish what I got. No, I gotta finish it because you're gonna be mad at me once I tell you what it's about. So it argues that Breonna Taylor was a casualty of the war on drugs and a system of policing designed to protect property and crush dissent. Now, she was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so the Grand Rapids connection is very important. Her mother, Tamika Palmer, was part of the reverse migration of African Americans moving south because they believed it was safer. Breonna's father, Everett Taylor, was caught up in the web of the 1994 crime bill and served time in 16 different prisons, in some cases for minor offenses that usually warranted probation. In 2016, he participated in a hunger strike and prison rebellion at Kinross Correctional Facility. And as it turns out, Breonna Taylor walked the straight and narrow and still wasn't safe. She was one in a long line of victims of the Louisville Metro Police Department, LMPD. 2 decades earlier, Louisville cops killed several unarmed Black men over a 4-year period. Groups such as Citizens Against Police Abuse and the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression took to the streets to demand greater accountability, and actually they never left. They were there during the Breonna Taylor protests. The officers who killed Taylor worked for the Place-Based Investigations Unit, which focused mainly on West Louisville, which had been targeted for redevelopment. The city and the LMPD tried to bury the incident, but Breonna's mother, her sister Jediah, the activist community of Louisville took to the streets in the middle of a global pandemic and forced the city to fire 3 of the officers involved, pass Breonna's law, banning no-knock warrants, pay Taylor's family $12 million, and agree to some reforms. Of course, that story is not over. And the book ends basically with an epilogue on cop cities. And as of right now, there's at least 69 new facilities being built to train militarized police. And militarized police, though, I should say, is redundant. Because let's be honest, police were militarized from the beginning, from the time that in the Philippines that they use, as Julian Goh talks about in his book, from the Philippines, that's when the professionalization of police is a militarization of police. So I don't want to say that I'm using a term that organizers are using, but I think it's kind of a redundant term. In any case, they built these facilities to train cops, all planned, right, since spring 2020. These were not facilities planned after, like, January 6th. No, it was the uprisings in spring of 2020 that said we need to train our cops to deal with these uprisings. And so Cop City in Atlanta, of course, the most famous, is a story of militarized accumulation meets the struggle for the commons and protection and restoration of the sacred lands of the Muskogee Creek people. It is a desecration funded with public funds and, of course, the Atlanta Police Foundation, overseen by a coalition of Black bourgeois Atlanta Democrats and right-wing political leaders at the state level. And as we know, the state will kill and lock up people for decades to make sure it happens. And that's what we're fighting right now. So to stop cop cities is to stop fascism. With the time I have left, now I want to focus on this one chapter, which is about Timothy Thomas. Okay, so he was a casualty of colonial war. Now, around 2:15 a.m. on April 7, 2001, Cincinnati police officer Stephen Roach heard the dispatch. Quote, "We have a suspect, male, Black, about 6 foot, red bandana, last seen eastbound on East 13th. He has about 14 warrants on him." Now, less than 5 minutes later, as Roach drove along Republic Street, he spotted the 19-year-old Timothy Thomas scaling a chain link fence. He pulled over and ran down an alley after Thomas, gun drawn, finger on the trigger. When Thomas appeared in full view, Roach ordered him to, quote, "show me your hands," but before he could comply, he shot him in the chest. Now, as Thomas lay dying, officers on the scene handcuffed him, eventually turning his body over when the paramedics arrived and never removed his restraints. He was then rushed to University Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Now, Thomas's short journey to the Hamilton County morgue began as a routine Friday night cigarette run. He was staying with his girlfriend, Monique Wilcox, at her mother's apartment in Over the Rhine neighborhood, which is on the northern edge of downtown Cincinnati. They had a 3-month-old baby named Taiwan, and they couldn't afford a place of their own. So that night, he walked along Vine Street past a bar called The Warehouse, where 2 off-duty cops were working security. One of them, David D'Amico, recognized Thomas from earlier stops when his family lived in Evanston, and he knew Thomas had outstanding warrants for traffic tickets. By the way, he had 19 traffic tickets. Thomas also recognized D'Amico, so he took off running. D'Amico called for backup and then took off after him. Thomas sprinted down Vine, turned on 12th Street, turned again on Jackson, looped back to 13th Street before ducking into an alley, jumping 2 chain link fences, and meeting Roach's bullet. Roach initially claimed to have repeatedly told Thomas to show his hands, but when he didn't, Roach assumed he was armed. Fearing for his life, as he says, he shot first. Now, when a police cruiser video cam proved the entire encounter took less than 3 seconds, Roach changed the story, telling investigators that when he saw Thomas, he was, quote, spooked and his gun just went off. Okay, spooked, of course, is like interesting choice of words, right? Roach was eventually indicted for negligent homicide and acquitted in a bench trial. And by the time the verdict was passed down, he had already been hired by the Evandale Police Department, which is a neighboring municipality. Now, the Black community in Cincinnati did not wait for an indictment. Thomas was the 15th Black man killed by police since 1995, the 5th in 8 months. Just 3 weeks before Thomas was killed, Cincinnati's Black United Front and the ACLU filed a class action lawsuit against the city and the CPD for its persistent pattern of violence, harassment, and misconduct targeting African Americans. On Monday, April 9th, mostly Black protesters crowded into the city council chambers. Among them was, Reverend Damon Lynch III, who was the head of the Black United Front, as well as the New Prospect Missionary Baptist Church pastor. He just took the pastorship in Over the Rhine. Also there was Kenneth Lawson, the attorney on the class action suit, and Angela Leisure, who was Thomas's mother. Okay, slow down. Now, after 3.5 hours of heated exchanges, but no answers, a crowd of about 1,000 people gathered in front of the headquarters in District 1. That's Angela Leisure, by the way, at the same event. So a small group decided to pull down the American flag and run it back up the flagpole upside down as a clear signal of distress. Later that night, the protesters were met with tear gas and rubber bullets. Within 24 hours, the city erupted in full-blown rebellion. Mayor Charlie Lucan declared a state of emergency and imposed an 8 p.m. curfew. And by the way, this sign is so important. He says, we are already dead. Fuck the police. Now, think about it. Like that's a title I would have used, but I didn't want to use it. But that sign says everything. That sign says everything. It says everything about what this book is about. In any case, still, some 2,000 or 3,000 people, mostly Black and working class people, took to the streets armed with rocks, bricks, Molotov cocktails, hand-scrawled placards that read, "If my son runs, will you kill him too? Stop killing us. No peace and no police." The Cincinnati Rebellion was the largest outbreak of civil unrest since Los Angeles in 1992, and the world took notice. NAACP Director Kwasi Mfume flew in to help manage the situation, and Martin Luther King III spoke at Thomas's funeral on April 14th. Appeals by Black leaders, locally and nationally, for Black Cincinnatians to remain calm and nonviolent when police continued to attack unarmed protesters felt especially hollow. The celebrity leaders who flew in for a photo op with Angela Leisure did not fully understand the level of Black distress symbolized in the inverted American flag. Now, nearly everyone who spoke at Timothy Thomas's homegoing emphasized the sheer injustice of it. He didn't deserve to die. He was a good kid, a son, a father who made some bad choices but was turning his life around. This is the narrative. He was unarmed. He died over traffic tickets. And by the way, the chapter's title is The Price of the Ticket. While this might appear to be the case, Timothy Thomas was already vulnerable to premature death. He was a marked man-child before he became a man, criminalized by bureaucratic means, by a system designed to discipline and extract revenue. from a subjugated surplus population. Now, Angela Leisure was just shy of her 15th birthday when she gave birth to Timothy Dwayne Thomas Jr. on July 25th, 1981. She grew up in Chicago, and at one point was living on the far south side of the city, just a few blocks from Trumbull Park, which is the site of terrible racial violence during the 1950s that Frank London Brown wrote about, when Black residents moved into what had been an all-white public housing project. Timothy was born in Arkansas, but Angela, partly because Angela had family there, but Angela was back in Chicago and pregnant again 3 years later. By the time she had her third child, a daughter named Tangelisa, born in 1990, she was living in the Robert Taylor homes, the massive public housing project with a reputation for crime and violence. At the time, HUD planned to replace the Taylor homes with mixed income, low-rise housing, but before the Chicago Housing Authority began relocating tenants, in 1997, she decided to move to Cincinnati. So she visited Cincinnati and liked what she saw very much like Tamika Parker. And she said, quote, "I saw children playing outside unattended. There were no drive-by shootings, no filth, no gang writings on the walls. But there was poverty. There was joblessness and violence. Cincinnati was home to more Fortune 500 companies than any other city in the country. And yet, the year she arrived and settled in the neighborhood of Evanston, over a quarter of the Black population lived below the poverty line. The region had lost nearly 2/3 of its manufacturing jobs since 1969, and the service sector jobs paid a lot less. Nevertheless, she managed to raise her children alone for almost 3 years before meeting and marrying Eric Leisure, a native Cincinnatian who lived in Gulf Manor. They were married just 10 months before Timothy was killed. By the way, all those pictures of Thomas, I think I have a picture. Yeah, these pictures of Thomas in the tuxedo, that's at her wedding to Eric Leisure. Meanwhile, adjusting to life in Cincinnati proved difficult for Thomas, although his experiences were hardly exceptional. Dyslexia disrupted his education, so he dropped out of school, completing his GED through the Nativity Learning Center in Price Hill. The same story of Michael Brown. Mike Brown also went to a special adult training facility to finish his high school diploma because of his learning disabilities. After his son, Taiwan, was born, Thomas aspired to work in the field of electronics, like Michael Brown, but all he could find were odd jobs and temp work, mainly in construction. His biggest obstacle proved to be what? The CPD, the Cincinnati Police Department. The cops had been chasing Thomas long before that fateful night in April of 2001. He had only been there a few weeks before he was arrested for receiving stolen property. He was 16 years old. Another day, he and his cousin and a couple of friends were simply standing outside talking when cops rushed up and, according to his mother, quote, literally threw him on the ground, put the knee in the back, pulled the arms back, put cuffs on them, and searched them, but no one was arrested. So these kind of violent stop and frisk operations became routine in Cincinnati and cities all over the country. When he turned 18 and began driving, his encounters with police became more frequent and more troublesome. In February 2000, Thomas was stopped and cited for driving without a license. The ticket carried a fine of $100, which he could not pay right away, so it turned into a warrant. He paid the fine, but then from March 17th to May 4th, he was cited and recited 19 times. 10 times for driving without a license, 6 for driving without a seatbelt, 1 for tinted windows, another for driving a friend carrying an infant with no car seat. Only 1 of the citations were for moving violations, basically running a stop sign. He received other citations over the course of the year, including 1 for playing his music too loudly. Added to the traffic tickets he received that year, he got 2 citations for obstruction of justice. These were issued, quote, in absentia for running from officers who had approached him. So they all know who he is. The fact that they could see him from a distance and know where he lives and send a ticket to his house. And why was he running? Because he didn't want to get a ticket. As a Black driver, he was subject to racial profiling. License and seatbelt violations alone result from random stops, not from observing bad driving or defective equipment. These stops function as a form of data gathering. Police log the names and plates of those who are stopped in a computerized database, which are commonly read as a list of potentially suspicious persons. So all you have to do is be Black and be stopped. When Thomas decided to run from the cops, once in July and once in August, they knew his name, but hadn't realized that he actually had moved to Gulf Manor. Therefore, they had no updated address to send a citation. Nothing he did rose above the level of a misdemeanor, but the persistent ticketing, inability to pay, and ability to elude the cops turned him into a wanted man. His 3-year ordeal with the police made him terribly afraid. Angela Leisure told one writer, she says, quote, "My son had a fear of police. His thing was, Mom, if they could do this to me in broad daylight with everybody watching, what would they do in the dark?" And he knew the answer, and so did his mother, and so did the entire Black community of Cincinnati. The city had a very long history of racist police violence going back to the origins of police in the 19th century. And Cincinnati was just one of over 100 cities that blew up in the summer of 1967 and again in 68 in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. One source of the rebellion was Cincinnati's anti-loitering ordinance. In other words, standing on a street corner or in a park talking with friends or just being Black and not moving was all it took to get a loitering charge. The Supreme Court declared the ordinance unconstitutional in 1971, so the city council passed a series of draconian emergency ordinances that imposed harsher penalties for rioting or impeding the work of firemen and other city workers during civil unrest. The state legislature followed up with a law granting mayors greater executive power to implement emergency measures and extending immunity to police and National Guard from liability for injury or death caused during riots. Now, over the course of the next 3 decades, the Cincinnati Police Department came to exemplify the worst aspects of racialized state violence. Between 1967 and 2000, the CPD was the subject of 17 separate investigations and countless lawsuits alleging a persistent pattern of racism and misconduct. The lawsuits, the demands for civilian accountability, the stagnant wages fueled resentment among white officers, so that in 1979, in March, 600 wives of police officers calling themselves United for Police and Community Service marched on City Hall to demand more powerful weapons and protective equipment and to condemn any criticisms of police officers. 2 months later, police officers staged their own protest in a one-day strike. Officers surrounded City Hall with 60 cruisers, turned on their emergency and headlights, locked the doors, and enjoined hundreds of others marching to the police headquarters where they threw their keys in a pile. The city council eventually gave them almost everything they asked for, including high-powered .357 Magnum weapons, expansion bullets, and bulletproof vests. They should have asked for a raise, you would think. And they were fine for that. By the way, these kinds of strikes were quite common in the 70s among police. Now, police operated with little to no accountability for 2 decades, until 1995, when a film crew caught cops beating 18-year-old Ferone Crosby. Just before 3 p.m. on Tuesday, April 25th, 1995, police responded to a 911 call complaining that a large group of teenagers waiting for a bus were blocking the entrance to the Commerce Building. When police told them to move, Crosby asked, "Why do we have to move? We're just waiting for the bus." And so the arresting officer, Eric Hall, then pepper sprayed and pushed Crosby against a parked cab. A local TV crew happened to be covering something else, and they turned the cameras on the events and caught everything on camera. 2 other officers joined the fray, with one piling on to Crosby and the other, Stephen Pickens, kicking him in the ribs and punching him as he's being held down. After he's cuffed, they began to pull him up to his feet. And a Black officer named Howard Smith maces him again. And Crosby is heard shouting, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." Crosby was charged with resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, felonious assault on an officer, and released on $35,000 bond. The footage, which aired unedited, provoked outrage, leading some to draw comparisons to the beating of Rodney King 4 years earlier in 1991, warning of a possible repeat of the LA Rebellion. Now, Crosby's status as an honor student at Aiken High School also made him an emblematic figure, or emblematic victim, I should say, of police violence. The NAACP organized emergency community meetings in Walnut Hills. Black high school students and college students formed the Coalition of African Tri-State Students in response to Crosby's beating and organized a demonstration downtown. That the CPD's internal investigation found no wrongdoing surprised no one. But with the national spotlight on Cincinnati in the wake of the LA Rebellion, the city manager reassigned Pickens to desk duty and proposed giving Hall and Smith a 5-day suspension. And the FOP, which is basically the police union, Fraternal Order of Police, went ballistic. Over 1,500 officers marched to City Hall to protest the punishment. In the end, Crosby was convicted of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct and inducing a panic. They couldn't hold on to the assault charge. He served 9 months behind bars. And upon his release, Crosby filed a $3 million lawsuit against the city and the police department for arrest without probable cause, with excessive force and false imprisonment, and he ended up settling for $33,500. The only victory to come out of Crosby's beating was that the city narrowly approved the creation of a really toothless citizens advisory panel. Then in 1999, Bomani Tahimba, an entrepreneur and community activist, filed a class action suit against the CPD after being held at gunpoint by the police in front of his son's school. And I'm not going to tell you that story, you could read about it. But the main point I just want to make here is that that suit led to a series of investigations into the patterns and practices of the CPD. And I have some numbers here, which I'm going to skip over. In December, Tahimba turned his case into, again, a class action suit. And he joined forces with the ACL in the Black United Front. Actually, with time going, I'm going to skip over one thing. No, actually, I'm not going to slow it. It's very short. So the turning point in this was the killing of 29-year-old Roger Owensby Jr. by 2 CPD police officers, Robert Blaine, Jorg, and Patrick Hayden. Owensby was number 12 of 14 Black men killed by the CPD since 1995. He was a veteran of the Gulf War. He had a 9-year-old daughter, had no criminal record. On the night of November 7th, Jorg and Caton and a Black officer named David Hunter spotted Owensby in a convenience store and proceeded to interrogate him as soon as he walked out the door. They held him in custody despite finding no drugs or weapons. Hunter then got in his face and asked him if he'd ever run for the police. And no one could know what Owensby was thinking, but he likely shared Thomas's fear of the police. So he took off running. He didn't get but 25 to 30 feet before he was tackled to the ground. 3 of the men piled up on him to subdue him, handcuffed him. Jorg put a chokehold on him. Hunter pepper sprayed him. Caton continued to dig his knee into his back and punch him. And when they finally decided to pick him up, he was unresponsive. They threw him in the back of a patrol car without checking to see if he had a pulse. And now 13 cops arrived on the scene, and they're all high-fiving each other, congratulating each other for overtaking and beating a Black man who had no contraband, no weapons, no criminal record. The coroner ruled that Owensby died by mechanical asphyxiation. Timothy Thomas's death was the proverbial straw, but the suffocation of Roger Owensby Jr. had left the camel irreparably fractured. Thomas and Owensby were just two of thousands of victims of the war on drugs. And they were killed because they refused to submit to a system with a long history of criminalizing Black people. So why didn't Owensby's killing spark a rebellion? And this is the last part I want to talk about, and that is where Timothy Thomas was killed mattered, okay? Over the Rhine was the epicenter of the rebellion. It had been the site of a colonial land war for at least 2 decades. Thomas was caught in the crossfire. At the time of the shooting, the neighborhood was 77% Black. The median annual household income had dropped to about $6,000. Between 1995 and 2001, police made an average of 2,300 drug arrests per year in a community with, like I said, I didn't say this, in a community whose population barely exceeded 7,600 in 2000. It was a land of abandoned, burned out buildings, a large unhoused population, an army of jobless youth hustling and selling drugs in the shadows of classic Victorian architecture. In other words, it was a developer's dream. Conveniently located adjacent to the central downtown business district, it was the home of the 123-year-old music hall of pre-war tenement buildings primed for conversion into hip loft spaces and classic storefronts. Entrepreneurs, speculators, developers, preservationists, cultural elites have been trying to take back the land once occupied by German emigres for at least since the late 1970s. And in 1979, a private preservation group planned to nominate Over the Rhine to the National Register. Now, residents, mainly renters, and the underhoused resisted the move for obvious reasons, because owners of the property would get a 25% federal investment tax credit for any renovations, which would raise property values and making Over the Rhine properties attractive to speculators, which meant that the renters and the unhoused would have to be pushed out. And so there was a movement, and I'm going to kind of skip over this real quickly because I know time is short, led by a group called Over the Rhine People's Movement, founded in 1970 as a coalition of 10 progressive groups to fight for affordable housing, social services. Buddy Gray, who's pictured there, ran a drop-in center for homeless people. And he founded the Ray Street Tenant Organizing Cooperative, Restock, which is a low-income housing cooperative that purchased and renovated dilapidated housing units in the neighborhood with money from the city, from grants, federal funding, and volunteer labor. So Restock was a thorn in the side of developers because they were using this property for the wrong reasons, to actually house people, you know? And so what happened was they were accused of stockpiling, that is, depressing property values and keeping Black residents in poverty. And it was a specious claim since the availability of low-income housing does not cause poverty. The absence of jobs, low wages, poor education, violence, cuts in social services, racism, sexism, not to mention predatory lending, payday loan companies, predatory policing, this explains the cycle of poverty. So business interests in the city invited the Urban Land Institute to come up with a plan. As you can guess, that plan was all about undermining the Over the Rhine People's Movement, underwriting private development, putting a moratorium on new low-income housing. But then later that year, one barrier was eliminated when on November 15, 1996, Wilbur Worthen, who was a Black resident in one of the Restock units and had a history of severe mental illness, walked into the drop-in center with a .357 Magnum, no one knows how he got it, revolver, and then killed Buddy Gray. And many members of the Over the Rhine People's Movement were convinced it was a political assassination. And finally, in yet another ironic twist, the forces of gentrification benefited from new federal guidelines intended to reduce racial segregation in concentrated poverty. How? New low-income housing receiving HUD funds was no longer permitted in impoverished areas. Think about the logic, right? And the idea was to distribute affordable and Section 8 housing throughout the city. That meant if Restock wanted to continue to get grants from the city to rehabilitate buildings, the city council required them to sell some of their properties to who? For-profit developers. So in October 2001, City Council passed an ordinance prohibiting the city from supporting in any way low-income housing in quote-unquote impacted areas. And the fight didn't end there. At the time of the rebellion, 600 businesses belonged to the Over the Rhine Chamber of Commerce. Main Street was the main sort of crown in the jewel in the crown rather. Art galleries, restaurants, jazz clubs, all of this replaced the liquor stores and pawn shops. And it was exactly in that neighborhood on Main Street where they hired off-duty cops like David D'Amico to do security. Meanwhile, as private developers prepared to leverage public funds to colonize Over the Rhine, the city got $100 million in empowerment zone money from HUD. Much of it went to downtown development to address problems, not to address problems of homelessness and housing. And by the way, they had money for a stadium, which is another story in this picture. To cover for its singular focus on downtown development at the expense of Black and low-income housing, low-income communities, the city and its corporate allies threw a bone to Black people in 1997 by backing the Underground Railroad Museum and Freedom Center on the waterfront. And of course, conceived by academics, because we always mess up, Procter & Gamble and American Financial Group, they underwrote, the American Financial Group underwrote much of this, and they raised much of the private funds to construct this facility. But Black people were not fooled. They organized a kind of, protest and talked about that they spent millions of dollars to represent histories of Black freedom while denying Black people freedom, resources, and security who are living. And in fact, when the museum officially opened in August 2004, the Black United Front, Cincinnati Progressive Action, and others created a pop-up museum. So there's much more to say in the story. There was a boycott that followed, and but in the end, I'm going to skip over this, the very last part. There was also one other initiative by Thomas Dutton, who was a late professor, who's at Miami University, a dear friend, who established the Center for Community Engagement at 13th and Vine. And the center promoted community-based collaborative research and renovated abandoned buildings using student labor for architecture students, for houseless people to occupy. And against this kind of David stood the Goliath of yet another organization, the Cincinnati Center City Development Corporation, or 3CDC, a private not-for-profit company created by the city and its corporate backers in 2003. 3CDC did for private investors what Restock tried to do for the unhoused. That is, they bought up as many properties in Over the Rhine as possible for redevelopment and received a giant tax abatement to buy these buildings. And the strategy worked, buying up and boarding up buildings all along Vine Street for the marginalized and isolated poor residents. And then that's that story. There are still poor Black people living in Over the Rhine. They're a fraction of what they used to be. So they didn't exactly disappear, but their numbers reduced. Finally, a postscript. In July 2015, Samuel DuBose was killed by an officer of the UCPD. The father of 13, he was a rapper, music producer, entrepreneur. And like most Black men from Cincinnati, he had a record. Between 1995 and 2009, he was charged 13 times for driving without a license, 4 times for not having a proper license plate. In 2005, he served just under 1 year in state prison on marijuana trafficking charge. On July 19, 2015, UCPD officer Ray Tensing stopped him for missing a front license plate, opened the driver's side door, ordered DuBose to step out. DuBose was driving with a suspended license, so he's like, I'm not stepping out. He closed the door, tried to drive off, and Tensing shot him and killed him. Tensing was fired, but was never held criminally liable. 3 years later, one mistrial after another, ending in a hung jury, Ray Tensing not only managed to evade responsibility, but the University of Cincinnati agreed to pay him over $244,000 in back pay and benefits and $100,000 for his legal expenses. Meanwhile, as the nation focuses attention on DuBose and dozens of other high-profile killings in 2015, Natasha McKenna, Eric Harris, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Tanisha Anderson, to name a few, another less spectacular police encounter involving Timothy Thomas's son, Taiwan, deserves our attention. So one afternoon, 14-year-old Taiwan and some friends were hanging outside of his mother's house in Hamilton, a small township just north of Cincinnati. They were accused of throwing rocks at a motorcycle. Taiwan maintained his innocence, and the police produced no evidence. And still, he was found guilty in a Butler County juvenile court. And he was ordered to make restitution by picking up trash. And that's the end. Thank you. Some of this stuff is my life, too. In fact, for a lot of us in the room, it's our life. I'm literally alone. So, anyone? Yeah, that was really good or really bad? Yeah. No? Oh, yeah.
So, you opened by talking about qualified immunity, and I know people were hoping that the Bain Act and legislation in Colorado and New Mexico would maybe change that landscape. Mm-hmm. And it certainly doesn't seem to be having any sort of impact. So, the other route are lawsuits, right? But it doesn't sound like those are working either. So in terms of the future, what would be the strategy other than staging these protests?
Right. See, the lawsuits, I would argue, do work. Okay. But they work in ways that are meant to reproduce the system. So the lawsuits actually are not just a shield, right? But what it does is that a lot of people stand to make a lot of money. And that's what the whole thing about the bondholders. In other words, if you're going to invest in anything, municipal bonds, especially those that don't have any particular, obligations, if you can invest in those bonds, you can make quite a bit of money because they're paying out so much money and the amounts keep escalating. The banks love it, which is why I thought it was so absurd that Wall Street took out, 8.5 minutes to have a moment of silence for George Floyd as they're making all this money off of the $26 million that his family's going to get. And so, to me, that's like one of the hidden stories. And if you can separate those two things out, that is tying the payments to municipal and county and sometimes state debt, depending on if you can sort of eliminate that, then the incentive to continue to allow officers to violate people's civil rights, let alone kill them, there'll be less incentive for that. And by the way, I was looking at, if you look at the list of payouts, we only know the big payouts, the dramatic ones. Some of them are very small, and a lot of the payouts are from cop cars hitting people. Because these dudes can't drive. They're hitting people all the time, smashing into things in a high-speed chase. Firefighters who are damaging, some of those payouts for that. A lot of false imprisonment payouts. So in other words, we think of the homicides or the kind of vicious act of police brutality when in fact the accumulation of these sometimes $10,000, $50,000, $40,000, and it just all adds up. And you wonder, how is it that the municipal police department's budget keeps going up, which is separate from the bonds? The debt goes up. And then the amount of money coming from private sources like police foundations go up. So if you just take all that accumulated money, just add it together, we would have the best schools, the best healthcare, the best everything on the planet. We'd have the best, But you have to add up all the money because it's way bigger than police budgets. But that's a good question. I wish I had an answer like what to do next. abolish the police.
Thank you for this maybe talking research. I wish I had this book before I finished my book to see how.
Oh, your book is brilliant.
Well,
You don't chase.
thanks. Coming from you, you made my day. But I wonder difficulty in choosing subjects. Obviously, I think there's a through line in the subjects that you chose because of the histories.
Right.
What kind of the difficulties did you have?
Well, I'll put it this way. The original proposal, I had about 16 chapters. With all kinds of people. And that wasn't intended. And of course, there's lots of people I could have thought about. But the choices were very specific, so for example, I wanted to tell stories that are about cities. The one exception, of course, is Mississippi. Stonewall is a tiny town. Whitman is slightly bigger. This is south of Meridian. But I want to tell a story about cities because my biggest interest isn't in police violence. It's in opposition to it. It's in movement history. And so the initial idea for the book was going to be an argument I was making over and over again, both in the media and in various things, saying that, what we keep calling Black Lives Matter didn't come from nowhere. And what we call abolition didn't come from nowhere. I mean, of course, all of you know this. I know you know this. It didn't come from, in other words, there's a history that moved us there. And not just the history, but you can actually name them. You can identify the movements that are part of this intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And so part of it was trying to do a kind of genealogy of that. But then I realized that really wasn't the question. The question became, what is the relationship, at least for me, between gender-racial capitalism and policing? So it's easy to say, joking, well, yeah, abolish the police, but what does that mean? In other words, before we can even get to that point of abolish the police, you got to figure out what the police actually do and how policing has changed, especially from the 60s and 70s to now, in terms of being generators of revenue and being burdens on municipal finance, among other things. The way policing changed, the way policing becomes a place to, or as Ruthie would say, just as Ruthie talks about surplus capital flowing into prison making, because you have surplus capital has to go somewhere. I'm arguing surplus capital goes into policing. And not just because police agree, not because, it's because of the structural elements of the way capital is moving, So that, and of course I wanted to tell the story of Walter Vandermeer, even though I thought it fell outside of the story. It was actually really central to the whole book. In part because I actually started writing a book all over but back in 2009. And my editor is like, that won't be a book. That can't be a book. Okay, so I gave it up. It would have been a great book, I mean, I'd be making so much money right now. I wouldn't be here. But it could be a great book. But I was told it wasn't enough. And so I ended up going back to it and realized it kind of fit in the story. And finally, there's a kind of idiosyncratic decision where Chicago, Ferguson was kind of out of track. When I gave Toni Morrison lectures, those lectures were called My Ground's Body. It was 2015. And that was supposed to be a book for Princeton University Press. So I've been working on this for a long time, off and on. So My Brown's Body, as of course, reference to John Brown's Body, was going to be 3 chapters. And I decided not to do that and fold it into this project. And finally, the chapter on Black femicides called Count All Women's Lives. That came out of my relationship with Margaret Prescott, who's an amazing, amazing Black feminist, radical, intellectual, and thinking a lot, because a lot of that chapter is about things like, Black women's Black women for wages of house workers. A lot of it connects to Ndaye and some of the Caribbean intellectuals. And so there's a whole Black feminist movement that was both fighting femicide, dealing with the police, but also trying to figure out, because they're dealing with the most vulnerable Black women. A lot of them are sex workers. A lot of them are, chemically dependent. And because of that, it's not just that they're disposable, but they have a structural relationship to the state, to the city, to the community. And so they have all these kind of arguments about the relationship between, say, welfare mothers and sex workers in this relationship to the economy. So those are the things I want to explore in that chapter, among others.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. One of the things we're learning with all the Palestine solidarity encampments on campuses is the history of relationships between U.S. policing and Israel, and also a long history of Black and Palestinian solidarity against those conditions and the marketing of Israeli security services and policing worldwide, really.
Right.
And I think Anthony Lowenstein's book, The Palestine Laboratory, is really interesting on it.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask, do you deal with that whole history? Does that come up in your book?
Yeah.
Just give you a chance to talk about
it. No, it does. I mean, I've done some work on that because I was working with JPP, and we had a whole campaign really directed at ADL, because ADL was supporting all these exchanges with the police. So there's a lot of information, Baltimore. And in fact, if you ever look at Daryl Gates's papers or some of the documents we have at UCLA, it's a relationship that goes back to before the birth of SWAT. I mean, in fact, if you want to talk about the real roots of the relationship between U.S. policing and Israel, there were Black police officers who came from Chicago who were sent to Israel at the time of the partition. This is when Ralph Bunche was trying to negotiate, and they worked in Israel and got some training. But the real training really takes place after 1967. And there are two things that are important to recognize. One is that so much of Israel's security apparatus was state-owned up until after 1967, and it becomes privatized. And that's actually a really important part of the story. The other part is that after 1967, they become the major exporter, not just of weapons, but of knowledge, and knowledge of not just crime control, but riot control. And so some of even the chemicals they use in Baltimore in 1968, some of that comes from Israel. So it's a very long and old established relationship of police officers and chiefs going there. And Stuart Schrader's book, which is, I think, brilliant, talks about it not just in terms of Israel, but talks about in the whole world, the U.S. International Police Association, all these different organizations had already developed, relationships. Again, everything goes back to the Philippines. South Vietnam, and of course Israel is part of that as well. I deal with it only briefly because in talking about Ferguson, the Ferguson solidarity movement was very much tied to the Palestine solidarity movement, and not just in terms of the timing of it all, because the 51-day war in some ways is displaced by Mike Brown's death in the media. And there were a lot of Palestinians in St. Louis who were very active in that movement. So they were raising this point about the exchanges even then. And I think, so to me, it's, like I said, not a central part of my story, but it comes up. And I think it's another part of other stories and things I've been trying to write about.
Thank you so much. This was really, there's just so much to unpack here. One question, I have a few questions, but one question I have is about the role of universities in these foundations. I was just at Labor Notes a couple weekends ago, and I went to this great panel on institutional debt and the way that universities bet on that debt make a profit off of it. And it reminded me a lot of what you were talking about here with the bonds,
Right.
the municipal bonds. And so I'm wondering if you could specifically talk about how much universities' investment in these police foundations came up in your research, and how present is that, I guess.
Right. Before I answer the question, I just have to say, I'm an old person. Old people can't hold things in their head for very long. I don't know if you know that. I can't remember my kids' names. Well, I remember my oldest daughter was my favorite. I remember her name. Although, she was not my favorite when she was younger. So my whole point is that I can tell you some things, but again, I have to go back over my notes. Certain universities come up very prominently. University of Pennsylvania, for example, and University of Chicago all have put money, and these are basically donations. They're not investments, and this is very important to realize. They're donations and not investments. So in other words, what they're getting out of it is an indirect benefit. So it's not an accident that those institutions, Emory University, I believe, is one, that give money to police foundations are urban universities. And urban universities have to deal with urban people. And oftentimes urban universities are these, land grant institutions that don't pay their share of taxes, in the cities where they occupy. And sometimes are, as DeVere Baldwin, one of my former students, wrote a brilliant book about this, universities are some of the biggest landlords. And they're dealing with, the actual movement of people in that. They're gentrified in many ways, or just simply police. And so I'm not saying that's a quid pro quo, but when universities that don't have their own police forces like we do at UC, it's nice when the police foundation has gotten money from you, and the cops have to come on campus to beat up some students. It's like it's a good. I mean, again, I don't want to make it a conspiracy or anything, but part of giving money to the foundation is a recognition that policing is so important that they need extra money to do it. That's one side of it. The other side, which I haven't looked into, and again, the book's not really about that, and I kind of talk about this basically in 2 paragraphs in the introduction. But something to speculate for those of you who want a project, here's one. I mean, it's not an accident that the university is also involved in research and development. I teach at a university called UCLA, where I think his name is Patrick Brand, who's an anthropologist, who is responsible for a lot of the predictive policing stuff that goes on at LAPD. I don't talk to him about it. And so the point is that universities are engines for new research around new forms of police technology. And this is a big fight, which means that if they have patents and other things, that's another benefit the university can get by having that direct access, because police foundations play a way more important role in the moving of new forms of experimental technology, like Peter Thiel's. And by the way, the CIA has its own venture capital. You all know that, right? Peter Thiel's, I think it's called. He had some. I'd have to look at my notes, but the CIA venture capital actually provides startup funds for people who are doing security-related intelligence technologies. And so Peter Thiel has this company that has this new predictive policing stuff that's been going on. Exactly. Thank you. Palantir. Thank you so much. So Palantir is a good example, right? So these are the relationships that are there. I think if someone did the research, they'd find a lot of universities probably give money. That's not the kind of thing you could find as easily as saying where the investments are. So I'm just suggesting for all those students who are doing research on your university and trying to figure out where the investments are, find out where they donate. And if they donate to police foundations, that's something to protest, among other things. Okay.
Well, Ron, that was beyond your usual brilliance. I'm sitting here thinking, oh my God, we're going to spend the rest of our lives unpacking everything that's in this book and trying to figure out what to do with it. So thank you. I guess my question is about the more positive, looking to the more positive. Like, how would you analyze the sources of the community in the Black community, in these different urban Black communities, the sources of resistance and challenging this? And whether it's coming from families or churches or schools or all different kinds of, or subconscious left. I mean, do you have any kind of analysis of where the greatest sources of strengths are coming from, or have you got anything going there? I'm just curious what your analysis would be.
Right. Well, to me, the model of the future or the present is Chicago. Chicago is like a laboratory for the way that communities have been able to mobilize, and not just for reform, but like, for example, it was a long struggle to get this reparations ordinance in Chicago, led by people like Joe Mogul and certainly a number of the PLO, which is not Palestine, but the PLO is like People's Law Office. Yeah, thank you. And others, and then there's UIP 100, is Recharge Genocide, which doesn't exist anymore, but it did at one point. There's all these organizations that work together to make certain demands, and they did the work in incredible ways. One, they went international to Geneva and made cases there. Two, they've been fighting. I mean, this coalition of organizers, they're responsible for Anita Alvarez not being reelected. They're responsible for the mayor, being defeated. But now, of course, they're also responsible for Lori Lightfoot not being elected because she was a disaster, So, in other words, they challenge power. They're building power. All that work over the years, they got something like $81 million in reparations, direct payments to the victims of the John Burge torture cases, which go back to the 70s into the 80s. And that's organizing. And they're also behind the Cops Off Campus movement at University of Chicago. So that kind of organizing across sectors, across, multiracial, is quite militant. They are actually changing criminal justice. The reason that you have a progressive mayor in Chicago now, almost all the people who were involved in the anti-police or reparations case, they were, including our friend Barbara Ramsey and others, they were the ones that were pushing for Brandon to be elected as mayor. And of course, no mayor is perfect, and being a mayor is something that I think I would never want to do. But all things being equal, it's amazing what they've been able to do to change the political landscape, So that's positive to me, and so a big part of this movement, everywhere you go, where they talk about Cincinnati and Louisville, you can't separate that out from all the work that Ann Braden and the, say the Kentucky Alliance Against Racial Depression, or all the organizing that was taking place. I mean, everywhere. I mean, the story of Jonathan Sanders in Mississippi is also the story of the building of the people of the provisional government for the Republic of Africa, which made it possible for Chokwe Sr. and Chokwe Jr. to even hold office in a place like Jackson. And if they didn't have that position, there's no way that Frances Sanders would even have the legal support that she needed. It's a tragedy, though, that what happened after that's a tragedy. We could talk about it, but they ended up being fired from the case, not by Frances, but by the mother of Jonathan Sanders' kids, and because she wanted to get the money and they didn't want to get justice. But those are, to me, positive examples, and there's more to come. And again, this ties to the bigger question that I started out with why I wanted to write this book. That's what the abolition movement looks like. It looks like a long history going back to Fred Hampton, and you could see a straight line. And if you think of abolition as just simply a bunch of crazy people saying abolish the police, that's not what it's about at all. You know, it's about changing political power. Okay. Oh yes. Oh, I thought you had it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be faster. I'll take more and more.
I love the focused on this kind of hinge where the body is a hinge between these spatial and economic systems, right? And that there's a kind of hinge at play in the law. The law functions as a kind of hinge, right, between who gets to make the profit and who gets to go to jail, right? And I was thinking how the chapters, each one operates on a different kind of hinge. And I like the way the focus was on place and space and how radical and critical it is that we understand that, because we can't tell the story unless we know that the space and the place is the underlying fabric for a particular hinge. And so I was trying to think about, you know, it's a wonderful follow the money story, right? And I was thinking about how do we devise strategies such that when we follow the money has to be accountable for having been found out. And that seems to be like one of the challenges, one of the key challenges. Even when we follow the money, we simply say there it is, and we can point to it, right? I was thinking, you know, Wells Fargo, wonderful chart you showed us. And I was trying to figure out, you know, how to articulate this question in a way that we understand. How do we shift it so that the body is no longer the hinge, right? Why is it so profitable to have this death? Like, why is this death such a profitable practice? And how do we restrict that confinement of profit? So I just wanted to ask, as you were making your decisions about the cases you were choosing, and I know in a way this question was partially answered, what is the hope in terms of this outcome of bringing these particular stories together around this spatial, financial, what I'm calling hinge, for lack of a better term, that I'm seeing operating in the examples you gave us? Like, how do we think that?
Right. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down all these. I'm going to take the last, right, we're out of time, right? So I'm going to take the last questions all together and I'm going to answer them. So I know you had your, and then you, and who else?
There was someone online who had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, online. Okay, well, then I'll take them all. Okay, so.
Yeah, I think it's a very simple question, actually. Yesterday was Workers' Memorial Day, and I took a look some of this data, and there are 5,000 deaths a year in the US, and
5,000 deaths.
5,000, and the number of Black workers is increasing.
Right, and these are on the job.
Yes, on the job, exactly. Yeah, on the job. So basically, my question is, how would you put together, you know, how financial capitalism work and how the old-fashioned capitalism work, and what is the function, the new function of a police, if you want, in producing and reproducing racial division of labor and the surplus population. So basically, it's how can we try to put this two parts of the discourse in conversation with each other?
Okay, that's a hard question. I'm gonna try. That was a simple question. Okay.
I just wanted to say that a couple of things. One is that I love that you focused on beyond saying the names, telling the stories, because it makes me think about the fact that so much revolutionary struggle begins with a politicized understanding of the story of the self, which is always an indictment of structural violence. And I wanted to also just ask you, you said that to say like militarized police is a sort of redundancy, but there's something about militarization which becomes visible in certain moments. and so that we can actually perceive it, whereas it's invisibilized, almost all the time in a way. And so I, like even now, in terms of the current struggle to get universities to divest, there's also a focus, for example, on DoD funding and university collusion. But and the UC came out with that statement from the regents, like, well, we're never going to divest from Israel. And then they also stated that pretty much rest assured, student tuition dollars that covers basic operating expenses. That's not part of our investment mechanism, and so there's this kind of separation. Like, we're going to do our dirty business with our investments. We're going to make a killing, invest in the war industries over there. But it also, it's a kind of, in a way, a division. Like, you can, don't worry about this, but because we'll do this over here. But really, like, so much is militarized. And I wanted to actually go to something that TJ was saying. So this is coming out right now. I wonder, you spoke about today being the anniversary of, right, and the LA uprising. And I think about the early 1990s moment. People think about it. They think about, Thatcher. They think about this moment of, liberalism. But it's also that moment is when the first Bush basically has his 1,000 points of light kind of agenda. And part of the pattern of neoliberalism is the NGOizing of social justice struggle. And right now, the ADL, from like 2020 onward, has invested in these funding mechanisms that basically are funding different racial justice movements. And that, to me, is an intelligence move. It's a militarized move, even if it's not recognized as such. And I just wonder, just what your thoughts are about that.
Okay. I have,
thank you so much. And I want to say three things. Number one, it's hard to watch and hear in the lineup of killing, Black killing, and hard meaning painful. And so I wonder how much porn is involved. Number one. Number two, so the police, what to do, what is to be done, that kind of thing. What about police unions? There's an argument made by a former political prisoner, and probably a bunch of other people, but I'm just familiar of it from Deruba Benoit, right? So you remember his argument about, oh, these are not unions. They serve at the behest of the state. They're not even, to call them fraternal organizations is another issue. But they're not unions, and so they should be classified as such.
Well, yeah,
that's a big movement, right? Or it could be a big movement if there were enough.
Right. No, definitely. I have a lot to say about that. I promise I'll be short on all these answers.
Okay.
And the last one is online, right? So how do I say it?
Let me see that.
I don't know if I can hear.
Hello, Dr. Kelley. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, I'm Ann. I'm from Cincinnati, calling from Cincinnati, the home of Bootsy Collins.
Okay.
I was going to ask, I recently heard from my therapist that on the street in Cincinnati, the cops back in the day all went to Catholic high schools, and that they terrorized basically everyone. People were scared of them. strip search women for traffic tickets, things like that. So making a connection to schooling, public schools, Catholic schools. I thought of Supreme Court, the Catholics on there wreaking havoc with their what they're doing. And I heard your talk in 21 about the book at the Havens, the Right Havens, and I started researching uprisings in Cincinnati. And so I wonder if how far are you going back? Are you going to the 30s? Are you going, and if you have time to answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to go backwards. So on the last, I don't have anything to say about Catholics, but I do have something to say also about Black officers. Because in the 1970s, Black officers were members of an organization called the Sentinel Police Association, which was actually very much like the Afro-American Police Patrolmen's League, which was kind of anti-racist, left, and against police brutality. And for that reason, much of the information we have about police violence in Cincinnati comes from the Sentinel group. And so what I'm suggesting is that, police departments are very contested. And the destruction of the Sentinel group and others, and this is tied to the question of unions. Sentinel group wasn't necessarily a union, but it was an opposition organization to the Fraternal Order of Police, which I'm guessing has a lot of figures who may come out of the communities you refer to in terms of, I don't want to make generalizations about Catholic. It could be something going on, but I don't know if that's the case. However, to connect to this question of unions, I talk a lot about that, and I'll be really brief. Of course, the first police strike was Boston 1919. And that was an actual strike against labor conditions in Boston because officers often had to buy their own equipment, the pay was extremely low, and they were fighting for changing in labor conditions. And that was a legitimate union. In the 1930s, the CIO began organizing police, again, around labor conditions. And in the 1940s, something happened. These are legitimate unions, and that is that legislators, especially mayors, said police are not allowed to be unionized for the same purposes, to go back to militarization in the culture, that they are military. Of course, you could say, well, they're not military because the whole point of 1829 and the London Metropolitan Police to separate out the military function from civil function. That's not true. And so part of the argument that mayors were making, that they said, like, if we make a demand and we need police to have security here and there, and they stop, they're disobeying an order. And so therefore they have no right to unions. And that's when the CIO initiative kind of fell by the wayside. This is in LA, especially, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, police were creating their own unions through these fraternal orders. Some of them were intended to protect the conditions and try to fight for better wages, and some of the strikes in the 70s were about that. But a lot of it ended up being about issues that are related to or similar to prison guards union. That is, we want better protection, we want better weapons, we want this, that, and the other. And then because of civil rights issues, that's when these fraternal orders became the means by which to protect police from prosecution. And the fraternal orders are inseparable from the sort of rise of these immunity clauses. So immunity wasn't always the case. In fact, immunity really is like a post-World War II phenomenon. And for a lot of places, it's 60s. The 1960s when you get these immunity clauses written in the contract, because what are they doing? They're beating up Black people in rebellion. They're beating up Latinx people in rebellion. They're beating up people who are actually fighting for some kind of civil or human rights, and by violating their own civil human rights. Now, was the police doing that before? Of course they were. course there were. But now the difference is in this kind of in this world with litigation and whatnot, it became more difficult. And then those became written into the contracts. Right now, SEIU was organizing police workers. A lot of people in the SEIU oppose that. I mean, I know my dear friend, Phil Fletcher, is somewhat supportive of police unions. I have yet to see any police union that actually operates as a union. Because what do police do? When there's a strike, who do they call? Ghostbusters? No, they call the police. And the police job is not to say, you know what, you're workers, I'm gonna stand with you. Now that has happened before. That has happened in the past. Well, Dana knows this, just historian knows it. There's been moments when there's been like, whether it's not so much Pinkertons, but part of the idea of having privatized police like Pinkertons is that you don't want neighbors of workers who also have relatives in the coal mines to go break a strike because they like them inside with the coal mine. And so this has been a whole process of sort of creating institutions whose job it is to maintain war. So to go back to the question of militarization, that is the culture of policing. Even more so now, even more so the kind of neoliberal movement that we're in, because there's no possibility of thinking of police officers or police in the same way you think of the working class, despite the fact that the conditions of policing actually have a lot of dimensions that have to do with workplace safety. And by the way, you probably noticed already, but policing is like, I think like the 40th or 45th dangerous job. In other words, it's not a high up there. More dangerous jobs are like delivery people or landscape. These are way more dangerous jobs. Most factory jobs are more dangerous. Being a cop is not that dangerous. There's still workplace issues. So, and some of the workplace issues centered around what? That's why you have the Sentinel Police Association. Their first thing was, you don't hire enough black cops. You don't promote us. We're the ones that are getting the bulk of the disciplinary actions. And so that's why they organized against the fraternal orders that are basically protecting themselves at the expense of black cops. And then women coming into the police force, they're fighting for basic rights, the right to be promoted, the right to have certain access, and those are labor issues. And yet the so-called labor organizations are going to oppose all of it. And that's why they're not really labor organizations. Okay, go backwards. Which I don't know if I get to all this. So in terms of the NGOization of social justice movements, I would my answer is it's all counterinsurgency.
Yeah, totally.
So, okay, now, Memorial Day, 5,000 deaths. How financial capital is working. I think the police function has shifted in many ways. In some ways, it hasn't. So some things are so consistent. For example, the police as protectors of property. You see it with the pipeline struggle. You see it with almost every single police role in strikes, the police role in riot control, and that's I think, really consistent, except for the fact that the numbers, the technologies, and other things have increased. On the other hand, I think there is a difference, and I can't remember if you were thinking in terms of each one. We'll talk about its relationship to death or just the finance capital. Is it both?
No, it's just the data I was reading yesterday, they were related to the fact that black workers, the number of black workers who die during their job, that is increasing.
Yeah.
So
which is
it's always been high. Killing. How?
Right. No, it's always been high. I think one way to think about this is that the police are just one part of a larger sort of matrix in which people are increasingly more vulnerable to premature death. And of course, we've gone through COVID, which skewed numbers in many ways. But this is the irony. And why is it more vulnerable? For lots of different reasons. Here we know. Healthcare, housing. George Lipsitz has this great book coming out on housing. People die for lack of housing, not just for being unhoused, but for other things. So imagine a world in which, venture capital can buy up properties all along California, whether it's Pacific Rim or coming from, BlackRock and these kinds of organizations, and then hold on to those properties so that people don't have access to, or use them as rental properties, which then boosts up the housing market and makes housing unaffordable rather. And that leads to vulnerability to premature death. And that's capital. The fact that we have the repeal of all these just basic rent control. I mean, rent control was defeated in California. I think it was 2010. No, later than that, 2016. And so all these things I think are tied to the financialization, the privatization of all realms of social life. And the privatization of all realms of social life means that the police are also being privatized. And foundations, other things are part of that privatization, but also the grip that corporations have over the, the monopoly of violence of the state means that the monopoly of violence of the state is not coming to save people. Imagine if the police were sent because so many people are dying on the job, and we need to do something. We're going to shut down this plant because people are dying on the job. It's like, everyone, move out, move out. That would be a decent role of the police, right? But that's not how it works. Exactly as you're saying. So I think that death is so much easier. That's the issue across the board. And of course, Black people die at high rates. Latinx people, Indigenous people die at even higher rates. So I think, that's the profits of death. That's what the term I use. I think that's kind of lastly, unhinged. Yes, I like the hinge idea. I never thought about that. And that works. The big question that you posed, which is a hard one, which is, how do we understand what to do with this money? And once we recognize and identify it. My response would be that all these movements people I write about, their argument, which I agree with, is divest index. So part of finding the money is just knowing where it is and then reinvesting it. In other words, move that money. That's the statement movement for the statement that put out in 2016, Movements for Black Lives and their agenda. It was all about divest, invest. And part of the shock of finding the money is recognizing, even we've been saying this for decades about the military budget, for all the money that goes in the military that could be redirected to something else. To me, the question is not so much what do you do with it, but how do we gain the political power and political will and ideological clarity to be able to collectively make the demands and actually implement them. That's the hard case. It's a political question. So anyway, and I went way over time. Thank you.